Okay, everyone. Let's begin our after lunch breakout sessions. So it's very simple. The way we're going to do this is divide you up into two groups, and you can decide which group you want to be in. The idea here is we want to get very practical and get very concrete and come up with some recommendations. Recommendations for, on the one hand, for those in, shall we say, on the media side of the equation, in other words, those who need money, and recommendations for those, on the other hand, who perhaps are the ones who give the money or maybe want to make a lot of money through investment. So it's recommendations for investors and funders, or recommendations for media organizations.
That doesn't mean, I'm sorry to jump in, that you need to be a funder or a media organization. You can be on each of the sides, on both sides, depending on what you're interested in at the moment and where you have more things to say.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we need a show fence.
So the question is, which group would you like to be in? One of you will be with Mira on the media side, and the other group will be led by Vince on the other side. So who would like to be on the media side? This is not a popularity contest between these two. And again, you can...
More money, better looking. I totally understand that.
It doesn't have to...
Trade-off.
I'll be on money side.
Okay, so again, who would like to be with Mira?
What's the concept behind dividing the two groups?
The area of focus. So what kind of recommendations you're going to come up with. So it all will be explained when you get into your groups, but basically think about it in terms of one group will be making recommendations for media organizations, one group will be making recommendations for investors or donors and so on.
That sounds like you mean that you want the media people to be in one group.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It's entirely up to you. In fact, we'd like to mix it up. Yeah. So
And it's better than having one big conversation. We want to get to more of a deeper discussion on both tracks, and then we'll pull it together at the end.
And hear from all of you.
yeah. Okay, so once more. Who would like to be making recommendations for the media? That's with Mira.
Okay, so that's a small
So it's a very small group.
Go upstairs.
Okay, so you'll go upstairs to the 7th floor. There's a very nice room there. It's the night badges room on the 7th floor. And everybody else will stay in here with Vince. And over to you, Vince.
Okay. So, do you want to have a do we have microphones too?
Whether they work or not doesn't matter, but
Okay.
testing.
Yeah, that's good. Great.
Testing.
Okay, so I think what we would like to do now is if you want to continue a conversation that you're having now, you could take it outside. And if you want to continue a conversation with me and all of us in here, I'd love to invite you to get as close as you can so that we can have an intimate discussion as much as possible here in the room. And I think I would take the prerogative to say a couple things about the first part of the session today. And that is, we've had, certainly at Media Impact Funders, we've had 100 sessions on grants and grant support from foundations to support media in the public interest. And sometimes when we're making grants, we say we're investing in this or we're investing in that. And it's sort of a euphemism for the grants that we're making. And so for the purposes of today's conversation, I want to make sure that when we're talking about grants, we're talking about grants, and when we're talking about investments, we're talking about some form of a contribution to an organization, an enterprise, a business unit that expects to see some of that money back. And then there's a range of expectations for that, a range of motivations for that as well. And so I think that might have been a point that was not as sharply underlined in the first opening session as it could be here. And I certainly don't want to make this, I'm not an academic, so I don't want to make this a lecture, even though that's what it feels like in this room right now. I want to open it up to observations from our panelists who want to go deeper on points that they might have wanted to make earlier in the day, questions that you might have had for our panelists as well that we didn't get to. But I wanted to make that a little bit brighter line for us to say, like, let's talk about investments, because that is certainly an important distinction from what we normally talk about among media funders. And of course, anyone who's running a media organization may say, like, the best investment is free money that you don't want back. I get that. But and there will always be a place for grants, but there's a spectrum of expectations. And it may be that the grant-making foundation has always made grants out of the grants budget, and increasingly, with mission investing growing the way that it has, program-related investments and other forms of capital that they may be able to marshal from their endowment corpus is now increasingly available, but it requires different case making and a different set of criteria and structures and disciplines on the part of the recipient organization. So I'll just sort of stipulate all of that, and then I want to just open it up to comments and questions from any of you, all of you.
Hi, I'm Nadine.
I'm gonna pass this around. If there's another one, we might do that as well.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nadine Hoffman. I'm the Deputy Director at the International Women's Media Foundation, and I really just wanted to echo something that Tracy Howell said in our formal discussion beforehand as a formal recommendation for funders, which is really about that thinking about shifting power and moving beyond our elite circles, because I think that's fundamentally the most important recommendation that we can give if we want to see the change that we're talking about in the media ecosystem. So really, I just wanted to plus one her, and that is all.
Well, I'll take that one back. Well, I would plus one that and also acknowledge that we're having a gathering of journalism funders on October 18th and 19th. We're going to have a session on addressing the power imbalance, and Tracy will be on that panel. So we're going to be getting back to that as well. Magdi.
Hi, everyone. Magdi Amin, and I'm formerly with Midyar and IFC and Government of Sudan. And I haven't invested in media at all, but just thinking of the past organizations that I've been a part of, what I heard in the panel earlier is that it's a problem of scale, and that is a lot of micro efforts that are very inefficient in terms of getting the kind of scale that's needed. So what it sounded to me like, a market is needed more than individual efforts. And if I was to think about trying to create a market in terms of investing in this, and these things might exist, but it would, at IFC we had something called the performance standards, which is a scale by which we would measure what was governance like, how do they do environmental protection, how do they treat people for every company. And once you start being able to quantify that, then you can start creating a market where you don't have to look at individually, but you can create an index and invest in a pool that you know you have some confidence in the performance of that pool. So I'm wondering if that kind of framework exists for media investing, and if not, then maybe that'd be at least a way toward going from micro to scale.
And I wonder if this mic is, this seems to be right, if there's a distinction between U.S. domestic market and the dynamics in the global framework, but maybe if I could ask Carlos to speak to the U.S. piece of that, if there's a way of addressing the how do we identify and make the market.
Quantify quantifying something called like independence. And so those
yeah.
who prefer that.
Quantifying it. Well, I was going to say, one thing quantifying independence is like, what is a return? I mean, there is a financial return, but there are other returns. And I think having a conversation with investors about what are the things that you want to see. So there's some expectations, some of that money may come back, but there are other expectations, other returns they may be looking, and those can be built into the investment. And I think that's a really good way of working with funders, because funders are really looking at making impact investment means making an impact, and making an impact is defined by both of you, the funder and also the folks that they're working with. So I think it's understanding that and then being able to actually have a business model by which you can start to do the model to see how much investment you can and what level of return you can actually provide. So.
Are you? It's like a game.
I know.
Yeah. Are you finding any of your investors, anybody, to be interested in kind of pay for performance models? No, I see Bronco's.
Can you explain what you mean by pay for performance?
We did a deal with one funder where the funder gave I don't know what it was, $1 million to the blood bank, and the blood bank's task was to secure 5,000 new donors who were in the millennials age category in a certain amount of time. And assuming they met the goal, they didn't have to pay back the loan. But if it wasn't met, they would have to return it over a certain period of time. So it's kind of a loan, but kind of a forgivable loan. Yeah.
And if you could all introduce yourselves when you're.
Yes, I'm Mark Nelson. I am former director of the Center for International Media Systems, and I spent a long time at the World Bank working on these issues. In having this discussion, I think we need to distinguish between the firm level or sector level issues that we're all trying to solve and the broader enabling environment in which all of these firms, or whatever you want to call them, the entities, operate. And in the work that we did at SEMA and the World Bank also, the real weakness in our media environment is really in the enabling side of this equation. That's where there's too little investment, inadequate attention. Policy reforms in the health sector or in the education sector that have taken place at the global level have been heavily funded by the global institutions for changing the laws, regulations, and enabling conditions under which health and education take place in multiple countries across the world. There's nothing like that in the provision of public service information. And we need to think much more carefully about how to move money into that kind of policy reform arena, because continuing to not think about that really big and much more expensive task means that the individual investments that people are making in firms and in individual companies to produce media are not as efficient as they should be, and don't have much of a chance of being successful. So I think we've failed to bring that level of thinking into this conversation, and we've been failing for the last 20 years to do that.
Do you have a couple of recommendations of interventions?
Well,
maybe you're more free to say.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that one of the big market failures is the lack of the World Bank in this market. Having an institution that is engaging with government, saying that you need an independent media sector in order to be a successful economy. Therefore, there are a set of institutional reforms that are necessary for doing that. It's the regulatory space, it's the legal space. There are all kinds of aspects of that. It's very complex, but we don't have anybody doing that because the World Bank considers this to be outside its mandate. And the other thing would be that the big funders have typically focused on the market level stuff, where I don't think they're very effective at all at doing that kind of work.
Any responses to that? But I mean,
I'm not responding to this.
Just hold that thought then for before we go to the next. Hold the mic. Does anybody have something in response to what Mark has just said? Let's go there first and then come to you.
Basically, it's emphatic agreement, but with another detail. Like Mark, we were both working journalists, and we both went to work in the kind of multilateral governmental system, I for the United Nations and for the World Bank. And on the UN side, as everyone knows, in many developing countries, the UN operates as a de facto coordinator of bilateral development assistance. And so there's all kinds of analogies you could look to where there is structured assistance for institutions, which can be equivalent to the enabling environment for media. That is to say, coordinated loans that go to the development of election institutions, human rights institutions, anti-corruption institutions, legal structures, and all the rest of that. There is very little of that equivalent in media. I just happened to have done about a year or two ago for CETA, for the Swedish Development Agency review for a training program they run around the world of different regulatory structures and media around the world, comparatives and the rest of it. But I was thinking about it when I was doing it, that if you look at, there's a world of press councils, there's regulations that vary for public broadcasting media, there are different import and regimens for nonprofit versus commercial media, and a whole realm of things varies from region to region. But a lot of funders, private funders have more discretion, but state funders are very loath to involve themselves with any particular news organization for all the obvious reasons. But if they can help in a structural way across on a high level, and it could be helping journalism unions or print, newspaper associations doing professional development, or these press councils that, aside from operating as kind of forums for complaints from the public, can also set standards, engage in professional development. There's a lot of opportunities for those structures to be strengthened by external donor support, which would be one concrete way of strengthening the enabling environment. And it's not something that is usually voiced as a demand or suggestion by either the media culture that's on the recipient side, and much less in the donor world.
I want to acknowledge that, so send the mic back to Branko. Behind you. No, behind you. I just want to acknowledge that there are important conversations in this room that are in completely different levels and tracks, and the questions that people have with regard to U.S. domestic transactions that will help in the transfer of family-owned, statewide, or regional enterprises is an important category of activity that's very different from the field that you're discussing, and I think we need to have this big conversation where we identify lots of really distinct, then we could have 4 breakout groups from this group, but acknowledging that we have these multiple things. We've got one here, and I want to put Khadija on the spot, because I think after Branko goes, I'd like to see if Khadija's not working on a new initiative that is at least in the territory of what you've discussed, a fresh new opportunity, and then we'll come to some other people.
Okay, the South African way is coming. Okay, I was thinking about what you just said about results. How do you measure it? And let me just try to be a bit esoterical. I think quoting David Axelrod, who said that American elections are basically the swinging of the pendulum, going crazier and crazier, to the one side or the other side. And it's happening all over the world. It just now arrived to America, but we see our a role as to help. So it's better this way, to help reestablish the center of the society. Okay, and then I think it's a crucial role, and that's something that we must work on towards, because we have a democracy pretty much all over the world. We don't have accountability. Okay, and that's, we need to, in order to have accountability, we need to reestablish the center, which can actually then reinforce the accountability. You know, so I think that's a massive role that the media should reclaim. And I understand that, you know, when you have a Fox News going too much to the right, it makes sense to go too much to the left because you need to respond to Fox News. However, you lose and leave a lot of people that would rather be in the center. Thank you very much. You know, so I think our role is to defend truth and to defend it from the center. Okay, and if you want to talk about results, you know, it's difficult to quantify any of those things, but if a publication or if a media group is successful in fortifying and maintaining the center, regardless of who's in power, you know, it's very important that we are not oppositional to a certain party, but we are in the center and judging everybody, you know, according to their real performance. I think that's probably the measurement that you want to start, you know, to base it on. And I think another thing that is a fallacy, which a lot of investors are actually committed to, is that the only journalism that is worth investing into is investigative journalism, which is a fallacy. And by the way, we do a ton of investigative journalism, but we also do 10 tons of normal journalism that creates the platform where people come every day and read, and then when an investigative piece comes in, they trust us.
Yeah, and I think
it's really important to understand it.
Make the same mistake.
Exactly.
It's only the city hall that matters. It's not the music hall or the restaurant. Every newspaper, of course, would pay attention to all those things, but media funders only pay attention to city hall.
Exactly, because that's the juiciest thing. Yeah. But our role is actually to provide a platform that actually gives the whole life support rather than just specific issues.
Yeah. Let's go to Khadija, and then I'll come across here.
So I'm going to get to your question, Vincent, a bit, but I wanted to just say something about results-based investments in media. And I think that in most instances right now, it's impossible because so many of us, and now I take a step out and put myself back in the newsroom, are just consumed with survival. And the best result I can offer a funder is the fact that I paid my journalists this month, that we published the news, and that we survive another day.
I think this is a really important thing, though, for funders. And this is, thank you. So I'm on. Let's go work. I'm on both sides of the fence right now. I'm on the funder side, and I also am trying to fundraise for a local journalism initiative. And from the funder side, most of the funders I work with are demanding metrics. And now, as a grant seeker, they're demanding metrics from me. What are you going to achieve if we do this? And I agree, and I'm thinking, is this one of the first recommendations possibly to our investors, is to work with us to be more creative in thinking about what those metrics are. One of the prospective funders I'm working with suggested, we were brainstorming, is it something about can you do a survey of how informed and engaged your audience feels now, and then 5 years from now do it again and see if you can move the needle. And I think that's a very hard needle to move. But are there ways that we can, I wouldn't want to suggest that we should try to eject 3 corrupt leaders in 10 years or something like that. But I think that the fact of the matter is that this is what investors are demanding right now, and we either have to change what they're asking for or find creative ways to work with that.
So I'm on the side of changing what they're asking for, simply because I think that the problem is so severe that we need to wean ourselves off of trying to, constantly cookie cutter what we're doing to fit into various funders' agendas. I think that the moment, and we've heard the conversations yesterday, we heard over and over today, we're confronting a particular moment in human history where where public interest media either survives or it dies.
Let me just jump in here for a second. I want you to get to the actual question, but I also want to advertise that Khadija was on the first panel of our Media Impact Forum at the National Geographic on June 1st, where there was a very long, deep, and thoughtful conversation about all of this. And I would just urge people to go back to that recording, because we really got into it, and I think it's worth hearing more about that. But I want to, with an eye towards 20 minutes, to go and lots of people to see.
And South Africans have already monopolized too much time, but yeah, so to Mark's point, and I think, Mark, I would love to hear from you what you think we need to do right now, but I think that the reason I left the newsroom, I spoke yesterday about leaving the newsroom, is because I was dispirited by this endless cycle, and I really believe that we need to work towards systemic change. It's not about saving one institution in South Africa and another in Colombia, but rather how do we ensure that the entire system shifts. And systems change takes time, it takes a lot of work, and we have to wean ourselves off of actually trying to find solutions very quickly, or trying to measure impact in a year or two. It is slow, iterative change, and that's why, yes, of course I'm going to plug the International Fund for Public Interest Media, naturally, Mark. But I think that IFPIM is vital in, first of all, yes, plugging the financing gap for institutions in the short to medium term, but also ensuring that resourcing for the kind of things that you're talking about is also available, because it isn't readily available right now. And who exactly is going to do that work, and where's that funding going to come from? So yeah, I mean, in short, I think that I really think that these are really hard questions. And much of my frustration as a journalist in South Africa is that often funders just don't understand what it's like to be in the moment, to be running a newsroom, trying to report on state capture while also trying to ensure that your journalists are getting paid, while you're trying to fend off lawsuits and various other things. Just, I think that this is a call for funders to dig deep within themselves, not their pockets, but within themselves, and think about the value of news media as a public good and what does that actually mean.
And operate with a little humility and empathy.
Yeah, no, that would be vital.
Okay. Tracy?
So everything Khadija says just resonates so deeply with me, but I want to revisit what Mark was talking about in terms of the World Bank. So there's some movement, this is the context, this is US. There's some movement in the US among policy wonks, and there are very few of us who are policy wonks in journalism, to have the Community Reinvestment Act, the CRA, which was designed to address redlining that bankers committed in communities back in the 50s and 60s, but using that CRA to address information and the redlining that has taken place in the information system. And so I think that is a path, sort of to your point, but it's with the local banks and local news. And not enough journalists are talking about how they're connecting, information is part of the infrastructure of a community. That's how we get to the CRA and making sure that some of those dollars that goes into building affordable housing can also go towards building the infrastructure for accessible information.
Great, thank you for that.
I hope more journalists start talking about that.
I just want to respond to the World Bank comment. I'm Padma Priya. I'm from India, and I am the editor-in-chief of a podcast network called Suno India. I just want to sort of set the context here. I'm pretty sure most of you know this, but how would, say, a World Bank or the UN, for that matter, intervene even in terms of, discussions with regards to policy change with a government that is actively looking at censoring independent media? So that's the reality that I'm operating in. my colleagues here will also tell you that, we're all operating in this reality, that there is an active effort to silence us or at least push us towards self-censorship. So in that scenario, why would you think that the country, which is obviously, I don't want to, this might sound dramatic, but it is heading towards fascism, would be even interested in, engaging in changing the media policy? I honestly don't think that's right now very probable. So in that scenario, what do we do? Like Khadija was talking about, it's a day-to-day survival thing for us. So what do we do then in the short term, mid-term? Because for us, it's like, in the next 2-3 years, a lot can change. Or in the next 1 year, a lot can change. Already there are new IT guidelines that have come in, under which a lot of us digital media organizations have been, put under the ambit of. So yeah, I'm just like throwing this out as a question, like, why would you think governments would engage with the World Bank or the UN to change things that are not really in their favor, honestly?
Can I just ask if you have an answer for yourself?
No, I don't. I mean, I'm extremely probably sounding very pessimistic. The answer would be that they wouldn't engage at this point because it is about power, like Tracy did talk about. For them, it's about losing power. So,
somebody is waiting patiently. I'll get back to you. Actually, can you hold your thought? So,
Sure.
Since she called.
Okay.
Let's see if you have a quick answer.
Okay, yeah, just a quick answer is to say that it's absolutely true that in doing these kinds of systemic changes at the global level with an institution like the World Bank, you have to opportunity in countries that are ready to change. But we're missing so many of those opportunities. I mean, look at countries like Morocco or Lebanon, or countries that have gone through periods of time of change, and when there's a government in place ready to make changes, trying to learn how to do this better, ready to make those changes, there was no systematic. This happened in Ethiopia, 5 years ago as well. There was not a system, a system in place to do the kinds of investment in policy change at those moments when there's a possibility. And also having the World Bank advocate for this and I'm just using the World Bank as an example, but the way it does the same, for central banks or for, independent finance management at the country level, it advocates for those kinds of approaches and for that type of governance that creates incentives for independent institutions like journalism or like central banks to be able to survive even in places where it can be somewhat hostile.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to respond to Mark's, follow up on your initial question or statement, Mark, and to put that into some context, because I fully agree that one needs to look at the broader environment, and especially the policy environment in which media operates. A week ago, I had a conversation with two CEOs, one of of our newspaper and the printing press, who wanted to know from me, so why do we need to continue making profits so that you as a trust can do the nice stuff and go and advocate for media freedom and freedom of expression, because that's a nice to have, not a necessity. And my response to that was, well, just recently the trust initiated the review of the National Code of Ethics, guaranteeing that we have a self-regulatory mechanism in place and now co-regulatory mechanism in place that, by the way, guarantees that if the next lawsuit comes, you will not end up in court. And you can quantify that. So that was my response. But I think that there are different value systems at play here. So I wanted to ask you then from, what you were saying about the World Bank, and I'm trying to make sense of it as well. The World Bank then taking it down to the African Development Bank, and their funding mechanism, the African Capacity Development Foundation, ACBF, they've always been very shy about investing in media because it's problematic and it's political. But do you think, for example, and this is my pet issue at the moment, I believe that the Africa Free Trade Agreement has great potential for us to change the narrative on investment in the media and the media as a vehicle, especially in Africa, well, everywhere else really, as that vehicle for development.
All right, in the continuing Mark Nelson Symposium, just a quick answer.
You know, I agree with you, and I also think some of the regional institutions like ECOWAS and SADC can also create incentives for this stuff, you know, making it possible for, and making the case for all the countries in that regional bodies that they need to live up to the standards that are being set at the global and international level.
So we've got Goldilocks mics here. Too much, too little. I'm going to hear from a quick point back here.
Yeah. Is the mic on? I hope so. My point is very brief. When we talk about protecting journalists and, of course, the media itself, in most of the developing countries and in post-conflict countries, the laws, we never concentrate on the legal system that always prosecute the journalists themselves. And at the same time, when there is an outflow of journalists going into exile, what mechanism and what do we use to replace or to recruit the next generation of journalists in order to continue the good work in those countries? So that is what I've seen over the years. So how do we address these issues? Are there going to be policies, the World Bank, the IMF, and others, to make sure that we sustain, and of course the legal entity, how do we engage them fully to understand the media laws and to protect journalists rather than prosecuting them when they change laws overnight to charge a journalist, for example, appearing in court in Sierra Leone in the morning, they change the constitution, they change the law. When he appeared, they say, you have been charged for careless talks because you talk about the president openly. So they said it's careless talk, and they said it's seditious libel. So what do we do?
Check 1 2 3. Test 1 2 3.
I'm going to try this one again. Okay. I'm going to go this way, but the mic is over there for the next question. And then we'll come here, then we'll come here. And we're going to continue this until the others come back. So it's up to them when this stops. Go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You've got the mic.
Yeah, I just had a suggestion or an idea just to take off on the idea of the survey every 5 years or something. We have, press freedom indices, and then you have readership surveys, and whole gamut of research and studies and surveys and stuff like that. But would it be possible to actually have a annual state of the media report which would encapsulate effectiveness, media literacy, and a whole bunch of things that helps funders understand where their investments are going? And doing this uniformly, consistently, year after year, also builds a narrative of the role of media itself, and also perhaps if it's done across countries as a way to determine, and bring best practices, who's doing well with, and sets a benchmark for where countries need to go. I mean, obviously, if there are countries becoming fascist, they may not be interested, but at least you're saying, here's where you need to be, right?
So say more, who would do that?
That's a good question. I'm not an expert, but for example, in India, we have like a annual state of education report, right? An ASER report that has actually hugely helped schools and education institutions understand the state of education, how children are learning in public schools, private schools, and so on. Yeah. And that's done by an independent nonprofit. So if there's some way to do it, to keep it independent, uniform, but kind of slightly comparable at least, so we know where we stand.
Because there are so many different levels of this discussion, it sounds like more than one report, but maybe a combination of reports.
Yeah.
I have a practical recommendation, and I want to very briefly, try to be really briefly, explain something that I am proud of as being part of the Global Forum for Media Development. In 2014, nobody believed we could get the protection of journalists in the Sustainable Development Goals. We had a meeting with 10 people, and we imagined how can we get there. And we said, well, if we get people from all countries of the world to say that we think this is important, we could get a long way. So we built a strategy around that, and we managed to get protection of journalists in the Sustainable Development Goals. Nobody believed it. I was part of the non-believers, but I was asked to lead this effort. And we did it on the basis of the collective input of all the people. And one of the things that I find problematic about ourselves, calling us a unified group asking for something, we're not unified and we're not collectively asking for what we want. So in the whole question about multilateralism, the World Bank, etc., we recently had a discussion with the OECD saying we want 1% of development assistance to be earmarked for media development. Then the question of the funders, the donor governments, is, okay, but the countries will say it's foreign intervention. And they get away with it because it's problematic, it's sensitive, it's politically difficult. But why are we not saying we need this? All the journalists of the world, all the funders, all the private funders saying we need the donor governments to live up to what we are investing and counteract. We are much more powerful than we think we are if we can unify about 1, 2, or 3 unifiable goals that will then be a reality of life for the Indian government, for example, to find a way to do it. It's not the end of the battle. The UN is doing a lousy job on monitoring protection of journalists. But I'm just saying that we have the power to do political change. And I have also news for the funders here who are interested or disinterested in policy change. We did this, I accounted $125,000 for this campaign over a period of 2 years. It's not a lot of money. So if we can act collectively on the basis of who we are together, we can achieve things.
Inspiring.
One thing I want to echo is I think there really is a place for collecting data, consistent data, and helping funders be able to evaluate on a consistent basis and understand where they should target funds, where there are areas of the country. I am talking US-based, but that's my perspective right now, where they can target investment. I also think one thing that's an elephant in the room is we talk a lot about the business model and sustainability, and one of the main reasons journalism has really suffered is that journalism never got any daily internet revenue. I mean, the internet, there is no local internet revenue that really of any substantial size that goes to local journalism efforts. So when we're building a business model, we're usually putting pretty low numbers and low growth on local journalism, which is local journalism ad revenue, which is going to Google, Facebook, et cetera. So if we're going to talk about structural changes, that's one of the things where if we improve the business model at all, a little bit, it would actually be better for investors and would give some more comfort that we could create sustainable models. So I think we're hearing a lot of how do we create a better environment for investors? They understand the data, they understand what the business model is. Maybe we can affect some change in stability in other countries or other structural changes that'll make things a little better for investors to be able to accept a lower return or come in. So I think that's just something I wanted to lay out there.
And pass to your left.
You almost made my point, but you left just a little, so I'll intervene. No, there's a little bit. No, it's a great point because I think underneath all this is the sort of structural change in the media marketplace. And the way we would have addressed this at the World Bank would be something called a universal access fund in telecoms. So telecoms tend to be concentrated. And so as a result, you put in effect a small tax on the end to make sure that there is a revenue base that then goes to cover the last mile that wouldn't be covered by market powers. So given that yesterday Biden had the tech sector on board and they made a very clear statement about reforming the harms of tech, it's actually a very good moment to propose something like that to essentially, rebalance the structural inequity in the telecom market or in the media market.
I'm not sure if this connects to that. It could connect to that, but you can hold it for a second. Yesterday, I think I saw the announcement from Berkeley that California has made a $25 million grant through Berkeley for fellowships for dozens of reporters across the state. And it was a great way for the government to use an intermediary to distribute, a large government grant to support direct local reporting. I don't know whether that was because they were able to tap, taxing the tech sector there or what have you. But it's, I don't know if Columbia's ears are burning when they saw what happened at Berkeley. But, we should be able to think big about some public resources. Does anybody have a thought that hasn't already been expressed? Or, yeah, I imagine you do. So take the mic here, and then we'll come back to you.
On a completely different track, kind of pertaining specifically to journalism philanthropy, one of the missed opportunities, and hat tip to Devin sitting in the front row, we were having a chat about kind of some slice of this at lunch, but I think there's a real missed opportunity in exploiting journalism's intersectionality. Like, I think of that as journalism's superpower. Half the faces that I see here, I saw in Perugia a couple months ago, and I love hanging out with y'all, but this needs to be a bigger party. Like, there needs to be folks from the peace and security sector, from the human rights sector. If you care about gender, if you care about women's rights, if you care about repro justice, if you care about climate, you should be funding journalism. And I think, I guess my pitch really would be to the donors in the room, because, donors are pack animals, and they need to hear this from their peers. But if we sit here making the case about saving journalism just among ourselves, nobody's going to give a shit. What we have to talk about is saving democracy, saving humanity, saving civil society. Like, I think that is the only way that we win this if we're talking about galvanizing philanthropic capital.
If you pass your mic back one and to the right there, I'll just share an observation that actually that's happening. But it's happening in a kind of disorganized way, that a lot of the media grants are actually being made in programs, deep in programs that are not media programs. They're being made by environmental program officers, and they're doing it in isolation. So I think the flip side of that is actually it's already happening, but it's happening in so much isolation, and we're beginning to have greater success at drawing those people in and saying, you're a media funder. You're in the right room. Come on in. It's not an alien territory. So that's the other part of that.
Sir, I don't know if this point was made before I came in late. I'm Mahfouz Anam from Bangladesh. Now, recently Bangladesh has been doing economically very well, and we have been getting advertisement. So the private media, which is very, very jealously guarding its independence and its watchdog role. So suddenly we have a new player in the block, Google and Facebook. In Bangladesh, 80% of the private sector ad is now being taken by Google and Facebook. So on the one hand, we are looking for new funders, and now we have new players in the block who are taking away the fund. So 80% of my potential advertiser is now advertising in Facebook and Google. I don't think you can talk seriously about media funding without raising this issue. Now, Google and Facebook can be approached to say, listen, you take 80% of the ad share, give back 10% or 15%. 20.
You'll get no arguments from anyone in this room. And actually, 80% is probably on the low end, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. So you're lucky. I don't know. We can take a deep breath and... Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Branko, send it up. Yeah, no, take your time. We're always inspired by what you have to say.
Just a few things. Just as advice to donors. Not every journalist doesn't have to be a good journalist if he's not tortured or is dying of hunger. Journalism, middle class job, we should not be, starving or being beat up or killed. We could be good without it. Second thing is that advice to the people talking to donors. This doesn't work with foundations, but with individual donors in South Africa, especially. A very simple message works pretty well. You get to keep the country. You know, you have to actually still have the
Yeah, what's
country.
that worth?
Yeah, exactly.
Something.
And we've got 18,500 members in a membership scheme who, remember, we are free to everybody. And these people are just there for the mission. And I think it's really important, that element of explaining that without us, they don't have a country.
Well, I don't have a way of summing all that up. My head is kind of spinning I don't think we talked only about investment opportunities. We talked about a lot of other interventions of different types of funding, but whatever you wanted to talk about was the right thing for us to talk about today. And it's just time for the other group to come back and join us. So thank you all for really sharing deeply, and we're going to try and keep track of all of this. Thank you. We can try.
Yeah. Well, I hope not. What medium?
Give me the other mic. Oh, I've got my hands. No. Set it down somewhere. How are we going to?
Yeah, I would just like to ask you for 3 more minutes of attention just to share between the groups what we've talked about, if you don't mind.
Carry on. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, okay. Carry on. So in our group, and it was small, but that allowed us to hear everyone and to hear different experiences. We talked about 3 perspectives or three ways of looking at investing in media. So one was back to the comment on whether investors should look mostly at news deserts and small local communities that are not receiving professional journalism, and how does that depend on the level of development of the market and also political situation. So there was a comment with the experience from Poland, where there was really an important intervention by one of the investment funds when one of the major outlets was being threatened to be captured. Part of the ownership was on sale, and one of the investment funds kind of stepped in and resolved that situation. So this was at the level of the national market. However, it was pointed out that in this situation, we have to take care not to forget about smaller outlets. So that was kind of that discussion, and this is kind of that there are markets where there is a need to do both, and there are markets where you really need to focus on smaller and somewhere on the bigger outlets. Then there is a discussion on the stages of development of the media companies. So there is very little seed money for developing new startups in different parts of the world, even though we've heard for some of the investors that in Asia, for instance, it's a very good time for new startups. So we also heard that in Africa, it's a very difficult time for new startups. So this is something also to look at what kind of investment can be launched and how to look for those outlets that you can invest in. We spent a lot of time talking about infrastructure that needs to exist for the media to be investable. And that's that point about capacity that needs to accompany investment in media. And we had some really interesting, a lot of examples about shared services between media companies. There was a very strong point on the talent needed to be competitive in the market. And that talent includes tech personnel, marketing, sales, fundraising, impact reporting. And most of the small media organizations don't have even close to needed capacity to perform competitively in these areas. So there was a lot of talk about potential for creating collaborations, co-ops, and shared services for media companies, not only in single markets, but maybe even internationally for some of these shared services. In terms of recommendations for donors, again, we heard emphasis on collaboration. on looking to help the media company not rely only on one donor. So when one donor comes in, I mean, part of the job is also to look for other donors and to create the environment where these media outlets also can have a sustained support donor / investor, sustained support. So that was another recommendation. Yes, in terms of our capacity as an industry to argue our case and to explain what the impact of investing in journalism is, there is much more work to be done, both on research and making impact reporting really relevant, both for audiences and investors. So that's one area. The other area, there needs to be a lot more collaboration on policy and advocacy building to argue with different sectors, not only investment sector, about what is the best way to support media. So that's in short. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, most of you were here, so you'll know that whatever I say next is not true. But nevertheless, for the few of you who are new here, I tried at the beginning to say that there's a bright line that we need to understand between grants and investments, and perhaps we'll talk about investments a little, and then we didn't talk about investments very much at all. So you can see how persuasive I was in that regard. But we did have amazing conversations about many other things, and Mark Nelson was with us, formerly from SEMA, and really laid down a very important foundation point for our discussion, that there are big challenges that require big policy initiatives, and we need to think in those grand terms and to really understand the sort of major international policy issues. And so I would just acknowledge that there are 3 or 4 conversations in this room. There's the U.S. domestic firm level investment opportunity, and there's the global major country donor kind of policy issues, and everything in between. And we discussed all of those things, everything in between. One important, I think, intervention from Khadija Patel, speaking as a donor, but really from the heart as a journalist, I think, as she has said yesterday, and speaking to the importance of, as donors, not imposing metrics and regimes that require the grantee, the journalists, to do too much of arcane measurement. And she got, I think, support from Allison on the donor side of the table to acknowledge the funders' limits to the funders' demands on the metrics. I think that's a deep discussion for our sector, the Media Impact Funders Network, to acknowledge. Tracy reiterated the importance of the power imbalance and the power sharing necessary, and we're going to be talking about that at the annual gathering of journalism funders, October 18 and 19. We'll have a panel on that, and Tracy will be on that panel as well. But she also made a very important point that there are policies that we may not normally think about in journalism circles that are available to us and that are relevant parallel processes, and the CRA process in where banks are forced to address the redlining in their housing policies. There's redlining in the information ecosystem as well, and maybe we should be able to call on some of those dollars to address the imbalances in that regard. We heard from someone from India who was here talking about we heard from you too, but your colleague who was sitting next to you, who's no longer in the room, I think, was calling for kind of a report of reports. Like, okay, we've talked about a whole lot of this stuff. We really need a report that shows us at the global level and at the country level what's happening in media support and what needs to happen in media support. Tim has taken better notes than my memory will provide, but I think we recognize that there's probably more information sharing that we can do and should do, and we'll negotiate how we divvy that up. We heard so many other points, but you were mostly all here, so you remember them. And Tim, would you like to maybe just step up and offer a couple of because you were taking such great notes.
Actually, you've
Yeah.
done an amazing job of remembering. Great job. No, I don't think I need to add much to that, especially since you were mostly in the room, except I wouldn't mind repeating the point that you made about how by bandying together, we can actually achieve some quite remarkable things that people might say are impossible. So if it seemed impossible to get protection of journalists in the SDGs, well, actually, with a very small amount of money but a unified campaign, they got in there. Can we do the same thing for demanding governments around the world to, contribute 0.1%? Is it 1% of ODA? Well, maybe we can. Maybe it's not as impossible a task as we think. So, and somebody else talked about the exploiting the journalism's inherent intersectionality. So, broadening the people in the room, in a sense, not just journalists talking to each other, we all agree with each other, but bringing in all those other players to make this a discussion not just about saving independent media, but about saving democracy, saving civil society, saving your country, having a country to still have, that kind of thing. So, but listen, I did take a lot of notes, and in fact I took notes from this morning as well. So I think I'll give it a try. It's a bit of a mess, but I'll give it a try to see what threads I can pull together and send that around in the next, couple of weeks or so.
Can both of you combine your notes and email us?
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. I will.
Can I just? Sorry,
please do, yeah.
Because this theme of shared services came up so many times, we have at the GFMD developed fundraising guide that's open to all of you and for those who fund, to all your grantees and investees. We would be also happy to cooperate in developing how to get investment guide. And the next step that we will be looking at is the feedback from all the grantees and investees on how are these processes really working for them and what are the best practices in the sector, both in investing and then reporting. So please get in touch if you have any questions or suggestions.
Well, I think that brings us to the end. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you for being so engaged and really interesting discussion. Thanks to Mira and to Vince. And I'm sure this conversation will continue, but really interesting stuff. So yes, I will try to send around, I'll try to capture what I can and send around some notes so that we have at least some of the takeaways from this discussion. But thanks again, everybody.